Welcome everyone to Speak in Thread, Hellen Ascoli, Burckhardt Pérez, and Sue Vásquez in conversation. A quick note that today's program includes live interpretation in English and Spanish and closed captioning in English. And if you'd like to listen to this program in Spanish, you can switch a language channel, and at the bottom navigation bar, there is a globe icon, and you can select Spanish as your preferred language. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billot. I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum, and I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. Next slide, please. The American Folk Art Museum currently presents the exhibition Madalena Santos Reinbolt, A Head Full of Planets, on view at 2 Lincoln Square until the end of this week, May 25th. With more than 40 textile works and oil paintings, this exhibition is the first comprehensive survey of the artist's work ever presented. Born in Brazil in 1912, Santos Reinbolt is best known today for her large-scale embroideries made from hundreds of threads, which the artist referred to as quadros della wall paintings. So today I'm pleased to be joined by Burckhardt Pérez for a discussion inspired by the work of Santos Reinbolt. Burckhardt Pérez is a curator and writer from Colombia whose work explores the intersections of contemporary art, craft, technology, community-based practices, and ecologies in Latin America. She's currently the Neville Bryan Assistant Curator at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in 2024, she curated Thread to the South at the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art. This exhibition featured works created from the 60s to today and with artists from 10 different countries. And it considered fibers as a conceptual tool for exploring the relationship between belonging, identity, and territory in Latin America. So part of the excitement in bringing Anna to this program was the opportunity to zoom out from mid-century Brazil and view Santos Reinbolt's work from a plurality of perspectives and within broader traditions of textile embroidery and weaving. So to speak in threads, this program is conceived as a cross-generational and a cross-geographical dialogue, inviting us to reflect on how textile practitioners like Santos Reinbolt expand the possibilities of representation, storytelling, and memory across South America. So I'm grateful to Anna for accepting our invitation to engage with Santos Reinbolt's work and for introducing us to the wonderful work and practices of Hellen Ascoli and Sue Vásquez, two textile artists working today in Guatemala and Colombia. So very excited to have you, Anna, and before inviting her to join me and also moderate and introducing our speakers, I'll go over a few technicalities. So this program will last for about an hour and a half, and there will be time for Q&A at the end. So please share your question in the Q&A feature or in the chat. And today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. We offer, again, live interpretation in English and Spanish, accessible by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And we offer closed captioning in English, also available by clicking on the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen. It's a CC button. Our museum is grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online and would not be possible without you all. So I hope you'll consider supporting our program through a donation following this conversation. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists like Madalena Santos Reinbolt. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Anna and everyone, also our speakers. So Anna, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mathilde, for this invitation to collaborate. Thank you all for joining us, and particularly thank you to Hellen and Sue for agreeing to participate in this lovely chat. And so, as Mathilde quickly mentioned, this program is we're taking the work of Madalena Santos Reinbolt kind of as an excuse and a starting point to discuss several themes that are important for both Hellen Ascoli and Sue Vásquez, but also to discuss certain themes that are important when it comes to working with textiles in and from Latin America. And so we will try to focus on these more regional perspective on textile making, and particularly contemporary textile making, but again, very much inspired by the work of Madalena Santos Reinbolt. As Mathilde mentioned, we will begin the program with two 20-minute presentations by Hellen and Sue, and that will be followed by an informal conversation in English and in Spanish between the three of us, in which we will look at some works by Madalena Santos Reinbolt and discuss the way that they're relevant to both Hellen and Sue's work, and also what they can tell us about working with textile in the region as well. And we will conclude with a brief Q&A so that you all have time to ask the artist questions directly. So without further ado, I will present our first speaker. Hellen Ascoli is a Guatemalan weaver, a word that encompasses the other areas of discourse that she situates herself within: art, craft, education, and translation. Ascoli has an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and her work has been exhibited internationally. In 2023, her solo exhibition, Cien Tierras, at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, traveled to La Nueva Fábrica in Antigua, Guatemala. Notably, her work has been shown at El Museo del Barrio Triennial in 2024 and at the Sharjah Biennial in 2025. She has taught at universities in Guatemala and in the US, and currently teaches at MICA while developing her practice in language justice. And she currently has a solo exhibition at the International Studio Curatorial Program in Brooklyn, which we hope that you all will attend. So take it away, Hellen, and thank you again.
Thank you. If you can move one slide, there we go. Hi, so my name is Hellen Ascoli. I am a weaver from Guatemala City, working in Baltimore. And I just wanted to show this quick photo, working with my main collaborator, a tool body, the backstrap loom. So next image, please. When I think about my work, I like to think about it as a map that I kind of walk around. And three key places on this map are the notions of affordances, which is how I read and develop object languages; proprioception, which is the sensory system that allows me to locate my body in space; and translation, which I define as the proprioception of words. In today's map, I feel I will mostly be in the area of my work that addresses notions of language, so translation, and knowledge production, writing, and legibility. Next slide, please. Let me start by showing you why the backstrap loom is a tool being, or why I call it my collaborator. When we look at how this tool is named in Mayan languages, particularly in this graph, in Mayan Cachiquel, you can see that it is named as a body. So it has a head, it has a heart, it has a stomach, it has feet, and we feed it as we're working on it. So when you feed the loom the trama, so the weft becomes the food. However, when it is translated over into Spanish and English, its meaning is diluted and the names become technical words like shaft or heddle or shed stick. As a Guatemalan but non-Mayan woman, it is my job then to address this mistranslation and understand how power dynamics have created a disintegration of knowledge here. In my research, I focus on unpacking if, how, when text and textile are encoded and read. I would also say that beyond the technicality of how language operates, I try to explore how writing, both in alphabetical sense and textile forms, is a creative act of thinking with material. By looking at how we work with external substrates, we can both organize and imagine a different world. Next slide, please. My ongoing exploration of X and E, although they correspond to alphabetical symbols, is a way to enter into the language that is produced by the backstrap loom. Unfortunately, right now, I can't go down the deep rabbit hole and technicalities of the backstrap loom, which I love to do, but I'll hold that off for another day. And hopefully these drawings can do the heavy lifting of explaining where I see the X and E form. E is a comb, an organizing force. X is the mechanism for change, a revealer of presence and absence. Next slide, please. In a visual essay co-written with Negma Coy and Luisa González Raike and the backstrap loom, titled Pochonik, we explored the disintegration of knowledge. The title Pochonik, which is in Cachiquel, is a word used to describe pulling apart the threads to weave in new threads to produce brocades and designs. It contrasts the image shown here, which shows the anatomy lesson by Dr. Tulp by Rembrandt. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this painting, and questions how this autopsic way of knowledge can be violent. Next slide, please. In this piece, titled En los hilos encontré, which means in the threads I found, and next to it, a video with Lupita, which is Negma's daughter, I experienced a very tender revelation in which we were coming up with a game for a book we were co-writing with Negma, and Lupita, in a very natural manner, flipped the notion of writing in her play. So if you can hit play, I think it doesn't have sound, but I'll describe it to you. And you can see that we're playing a sort of patty cake and coming up with words. And instead of saying, I wrote in the threads, she flipped it and said, in the threads I found. And this is acknowledging the agency of the material world. In this case, the soft textile substrate on our collective imaginary. And I think this is a very important flip to acknowledge. And you can hit the next slide. In the Threads I Found became the title of a book co-authored with Negma, where the backstrap loom becomes the primary structure of a pedagogical methodology. Next slide, please. In this piece, titled Luz Azul, I continue to think about how textiles are encoded. And I want to read you a quote from the book, The Andean Science of Weaving by Elvira Espejo and Denise Arnold, talking about the technique that I use here. A variant of the structures and technique of warp-faced patterns weaves characterized by the use of paired warp threads and a technique of counting by odd counts, usually of 2 and 1, is known as Lili Paya in Aymara language and Lili Payal in Quechua. It seems as if, etymologically speaking, in both cases, the term Lili is borrowing from the Spanish verb leer, meaning to read, as if the weaver making this kind of fabric was weaving or writing in the threads. Lili Paya would therefore mean selected by reading. This implies that the origins of this technique might derive from educational contexts or educational influences. So next slide, please. Here is a detail of Luz Azul, the piece you saw previously in the technique of Lili Paya. And I wanted to show you this so that you can get a sense of how picking up and dropping the threads creates this form of writing within the textile. certainly here I am imposing an alphabetical system on a textile system. And this is something in my practice that I sometimes question of how these two come together. But nonetheless, here, one of the things that I'm doing as well is using a palindrome. So luz azul is blue light in Spanish. And the reason I use it is because it is a palindrome. And I want to acknowledge this back and forth and multi-directional form of inscribing in textiles, which is not the same as we would do in alphabetical writing. So next slide, please. And then here, just another image as a reminder of the inerts that the backstrap loom has. So kind of calling again to its body. One more slide. So now I'm going to shift a little bit from the way that I've been talking about textiles as something that gets encoded and focus on what textiles do as a material substrate. This is Ana, pictured, her hands and feet pictured here, a 15-year-old from Guatemala that I interpreted for over the course of, I would say, 5 to 6 months in a secured facility. So I was basically shadowing her all day as she was navigating a complex transition, having migrated from Guatemala on her own and suffered an intense abuse during this process of migration. She was not alphabetized. However, weaving was a language that she knew and understood. Pictured here on the right is her and I practicing different vowels and consonants during school times that I accompanied her. To pass the days outside of school, I offered her some paper raffia and taught her a technique that I kind of learned offhand called random weave. This technique is an off the loom technique. So as you can see, kind of contrary to the backstrap loom, it is no longer attached to a body. It is no longer attached to an architecture or an environment. And I thought it was an appropriate material for her to record this transition between places and languages. And we would sit and just kind of allow the weaving to take shape with this material. So next slide, please. Needless to say, this was a really intense time for me, even though kind of ethically speaking, the distance between Ana and I should remain very neutral as I am serving as her interpreter. However, those boundaries kind of quickly break down when you're accompanying a young migrant for 12 hours a day. The process of the piece then, as I worked to resolve it and think about Ana, as I was kind of bringing it into my own practice, was also a very confusing moment. And you can see this here documented as I was flipping it all around and trying to integrate it back into the backstrap loom. At one point, I was thinking I would integrate it completely into the backstrap loom, and then realized that in her migration process as well, going alongside some of my migration process of kind of cutting off the roots in our connection to Guatemala, or feeling like they have been cut off. I moved it around in many different variations, weaving it somewhat in, thinking about Ana as a palindrome. You can see in the center, the X's spell Ana, which are meant to be read in 2 directions. And then finally, resolving in the piece here to the right, where the backing is a corte or a wraparound skirt from what I think is a nearby community from where Ana came from. So next image, please. I have continued to work with or collaborate in forming relationships as much as it is allowed or I am able to with some of the youth that I interpret for. So this is a drawing made by ED while he was in a detained facility. So although this is not a textile, you can see how it definitely points to the power of thinking with non-alphabetical forms. Or a case for art as a powerful force for storytelling and imagination. Here, ED was again in school and relating to me the story of his border crossing and coming into the US. And you can see that under this fruit truck, there are a couple of heads, and he was telling me how he migrated here underneath a fruit truck. Next slide. As he left the detention facility where I worked with him, his aunt asked me if I could continue to develop this relationship, as he was very much interested in art. So I had saved the drawing that he had made, and we were thinking about it together and kind of developing different strategies for him to organize his life outside of the detention center. And he asked me if we could change the scale. We also looked for ways of collage and kind of searching through fruits in a local bookstore when he felt anxiety, and cutting these forms out to then paste onto this enlarged fruit truck. Next slide. So this then became a large-scale collage on top of a found textile, and on the edges are sewn ceramic fruits. Interestingly enough, the fruit here reveals the material story of migration and the disturbing reality of who gets cared for. So on the right is an image I took at the markets, and kind of looking at how this almost weaving form is taking care of each little individual fruit as a product to go across the borders. And then obviously contrasting on the left, ED's migration story and self-portrait underneath the fruit truck. Next slide, please. Lastly, I will present a piece titled Hidden Pedagogies. Here you can see it on the left, hanging on the wall, not as a conclusion for this short presentation, but rather to continue thinking about how materials are encoded and our responsibility of thinking of different forms of knowledge production beyond the written word. So last slide. And here you can see some of the students at MICA, again, forming random weaves, this time not in individual ways, but kind of quickly accumulating this mass structure with the raffia. One last image. And I'll end with this video so that you can see how they're working.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Hellen, for that incredible presentation. And I look forward to hopefully be able to expand on a few of the themes that you mentioned today, even though everything is so complex and multi-layered. So before I introduce you, Vásquez, I just wanted to give you all a reminder that she will be speaking in Spanish. So please make sure to connect to the English channel in the bottom navigation bar if you would like to access our simultaneous interpretation services. Click on the globe icon and select English as your preferred audio language. Sue Vásquez conceives her work as an expanded form of painting through which she reflects on the land and its relationships. She experiments with the materiality of pigments, supports, and references that might otherwise go unnoticed to create a personal pictorial language. She creates pigments with stones, bark, and plants from her home region, Colombia, combining artisanal practices and working with artisans from rural and indigenous cultures. Vásquez studied fine arts at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Her work has been exhibited in Colombia, Chile, the UK, Albania, Italy, and Spain. It is part of the collection of the Banco de la República de Colombia, the Museo de Arte Moderno de Bucaramanga, and several private collections. Her most recent solo exhibition, La Cabra Siempre Tira al Monte, was presented in 2023 at SGR Galería in Bogotá. Her work was recently exhibited in Sembrar la Duda, Inicios sobre las representaciones indígenas en Colombia, at el Museo de Arte Miguel Urrutia in Bogotá, and at the first Santiago de Chile Textile Art Biennial in 2023. Welcome, Sue, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hola a todos.
Hi,
Muy contentos
I'm very happy to be here.
eh,
I'm going to share my screen.
Bueno, yo soy artista plástica.
Okay, I'm a plastic artist, a visual
Mi
artist,
interés principal viene
and
desde
my
la
main
pintura
interest comes
y
from painting.
he elegido algunas obras para
And
mostrar
I have chosen
cómo
some
mi
works
arte
to
ha
show you
recorrido desde la
how
pintura
this journey has been
hasta lo
from
textil y cómo se empiezan
painting to
a
textiles,
ilustrar esos,
and how
esas uniones.
those links
La
start
pintura me gusta
expressing
mucho,
themselves. Painting is
por
something
las
that I've always
acciones
loved
en
because
preparar el
of
pigmento,
the
preparar los
actions of preparing
colores,
pigments,
acercarse a los
colors,
trazos
getting
del lienzo.
closer, getting
Y
further away
siento que en
from the
esa
canvas. And I
acción
believe that in
hay
that action,
una abstracción del
there
mundo
is an
exterior
abstraction from
que me
the
permite
outer world,
ver
which allows me to
una
see
especie de paisaje interior.
a kind of inner landscape.
Bueno, he elegido entonces esta pintura que es del
So I have chosen
2015,
this
es un
painting from
formato grande,
2015. This
es
is a
óleo sobre
large
lienzo,
format. This is
una
oil on
paleta
canvas
reducida de
on
colores,
a
pero muy
reduced
contrastada.
palette of colors, but
De
very
lejos,
well contrasted.
digamos, pareciera una
From a
pintura
distance,
abstracta
it looks like an abstract
y
painting.
lo que permite ese
And
alejarse
what
más al
allows me to
lienzo
get closer
es
or more
empezar
distant to
a
the
tener una
canvas
especie de balbuceo
is having
de ciertas
a kind of murmuring
palabras que
of
empiezan a hablar
certain
del
words that
paisaje. No
starts
sé si ven mi
speaking
cursor,
about
dice
a
que empieza a
landscape. I don't know if you can
mover
see my cursor, my pointer now, but if
espacios,
you
se
can see
empieza a ver
there are some
siluetas,
spaces where we can see some
montañas,
silhouettes, some mountains,
caballos,
and there's a horse,
cruces,
and
cementerio o algo por el estilo, y esto es lo que empieza a
or
vislumbrar como
a
un
graveyard.
paisaje
And this is
interior
what I call
que me
an inner
permite la
landscape,
pintura.
which this painting allows.
Luego
I
impulso un
then
proyecto que se llama Alteraciones del
started on this
Paisaje.
project, which is called
Este
Landscape
es una serie de
Alterations.
pinturas en óleo
And this
sobre
is a
madera,
series of paintings, oil on wood,
basadas en imágenes
based
satelitales
on
desde
satellite
Google Maps
images
de
taken from
explotaciones
Google Maps
mineras a cielo abierto
of
en
different
varias
mining
regiones
exploitations,
de
open
Colombia.
pit mining in
Mi hermano es geólogo
different
y
areas
simplemente por
of Colombia.
curiosidad
My brother
entré
is a
a
geologist.
ver un poco
And just
cómo
out of
era la
curiosity,
unión
I went to
desde
see
el
what these
satélite.
mines
Y lo que
were
me
looking or
impactó
looked
mucho
like
las
with these
imágenes
satellite images. And these images were very
históricamente, ¿no? Como
impactful for me
el
in terms of
color
the
tan bello contrastaba
painting,
la
the
situación
beautiful
tan
color
atroz de
contrasted by the
extracción,
terrible
como
situation
armar
of
vidas en
extraction,
la tierra,
um,
malestares sociales
and
que
all the, of course,
trae, y
social unrest
también me
that
dejó
this
ver una
brings about,
frustración profunda
and
que lleva la
obviously
pérdida
it
del territorio que
allowed
habita.
me to see the
Entonces creo
large
que esto generó como
or
un
lack of
fractura en mi
knowledge of the
trabajo
territory that I inhabit. So
y
this
me
created a
obligó a
fracture
empezar
in
a
my
explorar
work,
la
and it
materialidad
invited me
de la
to
pintura
explore the
concreta
materials
final
of
si estaba pintando con óleo,
painting, what I was
con
painting with. You know, if I was painting with oil paintings
pigmentos
or
pues industriales, minerales,
pigments,
una
mineral
técnica
pigments,
pues muy
which is
occidental
also a
para
very
ilustrar
Western technique,
algo más cercano
then
de
I started
nuestro
thinking about maybe
territorio
finding something
para pintar.
closer, something more
Entonces empecé
easily
a
found in my
buscar
territory to
imágenes, por
start
ejemplo,
painting. Okay, this is
como se
just a
ven
small example
en las
how
imágenes de
these
Google Maps
images could be
y
seen in Google
cómo se
Maps,
ve un proceso pues
and
muy
at the beginning
impactante.
of a
Entonces
process
los
that is
pozos
very
de
impactful.
color turquesa en
These
realidad son aguas
turquoise
contaminadas
pits are basically
conectadas con
contaminated
carbón,
waters to be
ferronickel.
able to extract ferronickel and
Entonces
coal, and
realmente muy
so
contrastante.
it's very contrasting.
Bueno, empecé entonces a fabricar mis propios pigmentos.
I began
Siempre lo
manufacturing
llamé
my
destrucción
own
pictórica
pigments
porque al hacerlos, pues,
because in
bueno, yo
doing
vivo en la
so,
ciudad, en Bogotá,
well,
así
well,
que
I lived in
iba
the
a las
city in
plazas de
Bogota,
mercado,
so I would
un
go
poco a lo
to
que
the
consiguiera como
market plazas and sort
agrícola
of see what I could
de
find
tierra,
that was
goma arábiga
sourced
o en
rurally,
base a agua.
as well as different types of soil. And this is how I was able to explore various possibilities, various colors and tinctures that were of slow duration, because since they were organic, they were very unstable, so they would quickly rust or begin to fracture. So I began exploring with some somewhat plastified surfaces that would reject this pigment. And in that process, I began to discover some very meaningful poetry. Textiles began to weave in here because I began to explore books or recipes that were used by people to be able to dye their fabrics and textiles. This was part of the result after the fragmentation of the painting, which also speaks of a painting that is alive, that is transformed, and that is also destroyed, which is very contrary to the dominating oil paintings that are long-lasting. This also speaks to the fracture in our environmental and social landscape. It also led to the painting as an object disappearing because it no longer had this backing, or it was rejecting the painting. So I returned to what could be understood as more of performance paintings. I would paint live as a performance, and then during the exhibit, I would wait, and the painting would begin to change and shift until disappearing completely. I was painting landscapes. This project began to grow, and I began to invite others to paint and to reflect on sort of the way the landscape was crumbling. This speaks to our political situation and our environmental situation quite explicitly. This exhibit was done in Italy, in Rome, at the Maxi. Many people came together who shared this desire of calling out some very violent things occurring in our country. I would broadcast these voice calls, and they would paint on these wooden sheets with these dyes that had been manufactured. Of course, over time, this was lost. So this is a form of social outcry. Of course, I felt there was sort of a dead end in this inner landscape that I described, where I was exploring the violent social landscape. And this was eliminated, so I was left objectless. So then, back in Colombia, I went out to rural areas. I wanted to live in rural areas, and I reached Santander and resided there. I live in Santander, in the city of Barichara, along the mountain range. And far from the city, I met Nirko Andrade, an artist and researcher that had worked with many indigenous communities in the Amazon, as well as along the Sierra Nevada and other places. And he worked with the craft of weaving, and he began to teach me how to weave, but he also taught me about weaving more as a form of thought, as a form of reflection, and as a life philosophy, as well as a companion, a very faithful companion, just as painting is. And he showed me, or introduced me to, the guaneque textile, which is local to this region, Santander. So the weaving is done on cotton and it's painted. It was done about 400 years before the Spanish colony here. I felt this was a new gateway to be able to find that object and something to support the painting, which is something that I had lost, so to speak. So I worked on this first piece together with him, with his advisory. This has been weaved in a vertical loom, so the image begins to grow starting from the bottom and up to the top. Here I used dyed thread with varying thickness. I began to learn how Through weaving, I could begin to create various layers of painting when doing it while weaving simultaneously. There's also some embroidery that was done in a vertical fashion, and then, of course, painted and drawn. Just to better illustrate it, I also explored the loom. This is the vertical loom that I work with. Here, I'm painting the textile, the warp, and this is a very geometric exercise, as you can see. Here you can see how the layers begin to intersect because they have been woven. It's a very slow job. However, the pre-Hispanic pieces are incredibly inspiring to me. I believe they are incredible teachers. So I continued down this path of exploration, exploring fragments I did not know of. This is based on Muisca textile from a region that's further down south, but it's impressive. This fragment can be found in the British Museum of London. This exercise is quite similar, but all of the threads have been dyed with eucalyptus bark, and then parts of the vertical loom are left here. Here you can see there are stones, these pieces here that create tension. This too speaks of how this painting has been created. And I call it painting because that is the way I see it. It's a painting created by a weaver. So I began to interact with these pre-Hispanic pieces. It's a very personal relationship, a teacher-maestro relationship. So I do them and then I do them over again and then over again. It's as if you were rereading a book. Here you can see it closer up, the way I start to change the thread used, and it changes the layers of color as far as meaning. More than trying to find a meaning, what I'm trying to do is pay close attention to what I'm doing while I do it, because this is a slow process. So I need to be paying attention to what I'm dreaming of, what the weather is like, what I'm thinking, and other things like that as I work on the weft. With this same reference, you can see how the various layers begin to have more depth. In this case, I'm also looking to determine which is the lacking fragment in this piece. There are, of course, many possibilities here, which allows me to have multiple layers. Over time, I've been working with other artists and craftsmen and women, specifically the weavers of charalá, women who incarnate and represent indigenous women that have been whitened due to very early violent colonization. And yet their legacy is present through their crafts. So I work on these pieces together with them, working hand in hand. I chose this piece to speak to the first image I shared with you, because this is my own piece without a clear reference. But what has occurred is that certain forms of representation are present here, inspired with indigenous communities, things like symmetry or the simplicity, certain symbols that, although are not precise symbols, it's something that's done much more intuitively. I'm not painting in a vertical fashion, but rather after it's off the loom, I paint on a table. And this allows me to have more organic symmetries, geometric pieces. And then here there's some murmuring of a moon, dog, fire. And it begins to once again speak to this inner landscape once again. And on this occasion, a more rural landscape, which is what I was yearning for and longing for. This is another example, a river, nighttime. And of course, I always include these layers of fabric.
Muchas gracias, Sue.
Thank you very much, Sue.
I'll switch to English really quickly. Thank you, Sue, again for that beautiful and very poetic presentation. I'm really excited to have the chance to sort of, again, expand on some of the themes that you're highlighting and maybe create connections to both Hellen's work and obviously Madalena Santos Reinbolt. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning, this program doesn't really seek to kind of analyze the work of Madalena Santos Reinbolt, but instead we will be looking at a few of her pieces as a starting point to discuss overlapping themes between Sue Hellen's and her work, but also some important themes around textiles and sort of thinking through textiles, particularly with working when it comes to working from within Latin America and the diasporas. And so I'm going to just really quickly share my screen. And I'd like to start by looking at these two works, which in order to maybe explore a little bit more this sort of relationship between painting and textiles and how and what it can say about the limitations and the possibilities of textiles. So the works that you are seeing here were created by Madalena Santos Reinbolt, with years apart, but they actually depict the same scene. It depicts El Salvador, which is the city that she moved to when she left her native Bahia in looking for domestic work. And you can kind of see that those cities identifiable by the presence of La Cerda elevator, which is an iconic urban landmine. But despite sharing this motif, you can kind of very clearly see that one of the images, the earlier one on the left-hand side, is a painting, whereas the other one is an embroidery, which is the medium that she eventually chose and used for the majority of her practice. And as I mentioned before, they were created years apart. In the painting, the city is kind of partitioned neatly into distinct neighborhoods. And so in a way, it is a much more rigid work. It focuses on the architecture and the structural aspects of the city. But if you look at the textile work on the right, which again was created years later, it instead emphasizes the city's inhabitants and its racial division. It has a lot more movement in it. So in a way, it kind of focuses on what is alive. And I think that really speaks to her own approach to textile, which was kind of free form. And so even though her first medium was painting, and it's often said that she kind of switched to embroidery for practical reasons because the painting or the soap that she was using to wash her hands after painting was giving her an allergy. It's also said that maybe she switched to embroidery because she could sell it for like higher amounts of money, etc. But what I want to look at here is that there was a clear shift in concept as well when she switched to textiles. And I think that speaks a lot to both Sue and Hellen's work. And so I guess the question that I'll start with is, it's a large question and maybe it's more of an idea than a question, but it's like, what really, for both of you, what are the possibilities of textiles? And what can they offer in relationship, for example, to painting in your case, Sue, and other mediums? But also, I think one important thing is, what are their limitations, if any? Before I kind of pass it over to you both, I just wanted to kind of highlight two of your works. Obviously, Sue Mantoguane, which is the work that you and I first connected over, really speaks to this very clear relationship between painting and textile that you highlighted in your presentation. It's, of course, it's a textile that is referencing another textile that was in turn painted, and you and Nirko are actually trying to weave that which was painted. And so I'm wondering if this work in particular sort of gave you an idea of why textile can kind of open up, create more free avenues for exploration. And if in that exploration, you also found some limitations. And of course, maybe to just leave you with an idea, Hellen, is you mentioned that you didn't really have time to speak about the kind of technicalities of the backstrap bloom, but I wonder if we could sort of start from there to think about how those technicalities are really what inform your work and inform not only the structure of your work, but also the concept or like the conceptual aspect of your work. So it's a really, I mean, obviously it's a really close collaboration, but it's also one that comes with structures that you can either follow or not. So I'll leave you both with those ideas, and hopefully this will be a more conversational, informal discussion as opposed to just a kind of rigid back and forth.
Bueno, pues un poco para responder desde la
I would like to answer from the perspective of painting.
Creo que hay el cambio de velocidad
I think that
que
the change
empezó
of speed
a
is
dejar
what
de ver, sí, no sé, como, a ver, la
allowed
pintura
me
es un poco más veloz
to see. I think the
aparecer.
painting is a lot faster, really,
Y eso
in the
cambia la
way it
relación
comes about, and that creates a different
al
relationship
crear.
when we create.
Y la
And with
temporalidad
weaving, there is
meditativa, un ritmo
a
también que se repite,
meditative
que la pintura
timeline,
es
and
bastante
it's a
diferente.
different
Entonces,
rhythm.
creo que
And in painting is quite different
materialidad
in
o
that
la
sense. And I
suavidad
think the
del hilo
material aspect, the
y la no
softness of the
toxicidad
threads,
también
the no
de
toxicity
la
of
geometría
weaving as well,
da
is
también
something
como una
that
posibilidad
creates
de hablar con más calidez o con más
a possibility of
intimidad
speaking with more intimacy
en las imágenes.
on through images.
Sí, me gustaría aportar eso.
I think that's what I would like to comment on that.
I love going into the technical aspects of the backstrap loom. One of the things that it's not limiting, but I will say is a constraint of working on the backstrap loom, is that the way I'm choosing to work, because I'm deeply committed or invested in warp-faced weavings, is that once the warp is set, there is a sort of locking in to some form of design. And you can always change the warp or manipulate the warp by picking is one, adding supplemental threads is another, certainly dyeing, which is an aspect that I haven't gone into, but I'm really inspired now seeing Sue's work. But once I've kind of made the warp, there is a sense that I am constrained, right? And I find that constraint can be something that pushes you to go deeper in one direction, although it can be uncomfortable. Like you really have to manage that constraint and plan ahead. And it's not as free form as sometimes I would like. It's kind of like the difference between drawing on a predetermined grid or drawing on a white sheet of paper, if I could explain it almost very simply. That said, one of the things that I think about that can maybe speak to the work that we're seeing here today is this notion of change or perhaps death. Because one of the things that I think of when I'm weaving is that there is this moment that when you cut it off the loom or you take it off the loom, all of that tension that you're holding it with, it kind of collapses. Like, so in looking at this image, you can see the threads there are very taut and it's attached to my body. And then like in contrast with the fabric that's just kind of laying on the floor and it kind of like loses all of that and just kind of falls down. And then one of the things that I think of in my own practice is how when something comes off the loom, then it's my job to revive it and to kind of give it a new life. So I think a lot about how to display it, how to re-put it into a context or hang it or put it in relationship to an object that it speaks to, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to get at with no sense of conclusion, obviously, is that change is inevitable. And even though I'm kind of locking myself into a certain type of design, then the fabric always continues to live on and then be shown in different iterations. Hopefully that kind of spoke to some of this.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you. And I think you both said something that is very beautiful and relates and I think in a way relates to each other, which is this idea of temporality that Sue mentioned. I think, Hellen, you're talking about this idea of birth and rebirth that is kind of obligatory when it comes to textiles. You know, once you finish and you cut off, it's kind of dying, but it inevitably has another life. And I think that kind of speaks to this idea, and particularly when thinking about textiles in Latin America, of like maybe alternative temporalities, like as you're saying, maybe when you're weaving, you're sort of entering into a structure that is not entirely your own. You know, it's also the looms, it's also the textiles. But in a way, when you enter that, you also enter a different time and another way of thinking about time. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've thought about, either of you, sort of when sort of opening up, by engaging in textiles, you're opening up sort of doors to different knowledge systems. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But like you're also opening up doors to different notions of time, both physically and also kind of conceptually.
Sí, es muy impresionante
Yes,
para mí, por ejemplo,
it is
en
very
los
impressive for me with
prehispánicos, esos
pre-Hispanic
portales
textiles.
tan
They are
antiguos, tan antiguos.
portals to
Y de hecho
very ancient times.
no sé, un primer
And
ejercicio de
in fact,
reinterpretación de
the
una
first reinterpretation exercise of the guane
era curiosidad,
textile,
¿no? Pero ¿cómo lo
my
hicieron?
question was really a
Obviamente
curiosity.
1200,
How was this made in the year
Hay otro proyecto que me parece que
1200?
en
And
esa, no sé, por ejemplo, ver a Helen en su espacio cotidiano, ¿no? En la
like,
cocina,
for instance, seeing Helen in
su espacio de casa,
her kitchen, you know, her own home,
muy
that
grande.
also
La
creates a
pintura
huge
se
difference because
abstrae, sí, es
painting
solitario.
is
El textil
allows you
presta un
to
poco más
get
para
abstracted, and it's
realmente
very lonely.
vivir.
But textile is
Creo que
something,
cuando hacía
weaving is
esto
something that allows you
Silvana
to,
me preguntaba, bueno,
you
pero
know, accompany your
¿qué estaban
daily
haciendo
life.
los indígenas
And
en ese momento?
but so I wonder
¿Por
about
qué lo
this
hacían?
particular
¿Cómo,
textile,
cómo lo
what
hacían? Obvio, esto no lo
indigenous
puedo
peoples were
responder,
doing at that time. How were they doing it?
fantaseaba
Well, I might be able to
solamente
answer, but I
en
was
eso, ¿no?
just
En imaginar
fantasizing about
esa
how
vida
to
cotidiana
imagine
y
that daily life,
sí,
and yeah,
sin poder resolverla, ¿no?
without being able to, of course, come with a proper answer to that. But
Cotidianidad, the everydayness. Sorry, I almost want to answer in Spanish, but yeah, I think a lot about this daily aspect of weaving. I don't want to romanticize it too much because I also want to be careful with thinking about that. But I have in my daily like journal, and sometimes I fulfill this and sometimes I don't, but I say like a good day is if I weave, write, and walk. And what does weaving kind of, how does that hold space in my daily activity? Obviously, there's times that I can do this and times that I can't. But going back a little bit to this question of time, I want to link it to a couple of things. The first one is this use of technology and how that influences our thinking. And then the way that we move and interact with technology and how that too influences our thinking. So the backstrap loom is definitely a form of technology, right? And if you think, I like to think a lot about how tools will allow for different space. So if you think of how you were to respond on Instagram or Twitter in these very short sentences or kind of quick blips, and then if you were to think, would you be so quick to respond if you were, you know, in a different frame of mind where it's going slower? It does slow your thinking and response rate down. And I think that's something that we can learn from right now. And the way that I'm linking this as well to movement is just the position my body takes. Obviously, my body in relationship to a backstrap loom is going to be very different than my body in a relationship to a computer. The physical aspect of it, I've initially, as in that photo you saw, I was weaving on a chair. Over the past, I would say 5 or 6 years, I've removed the chair and I tend to often weave from the floor. And that also gives me a different sense of time and space being connected to the floor. I like to weave attached so that I have a window view. So right now I'm in my studio, the window's over there, the backstrap loom is here, so that I'm always kind of looking out into nature, even though I can't always attach myself, let's say, to a tree. But feeling that I'm still connected to elements around me. So yeah, I'll kind of just speak to that, both inserting these notions of movement and technology into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I guess this idea of sort of textiles as a meeting place, or like, is relevant, I guess, for what my next question, which basically I wanted to kind of take a look at this work, which is an image that you can kind of see. Obviously, it's an embroidery that depicts the Last Supper, but you can very easily see that it sort of shows very racially diverse cast of angels, a lot of different figures that, you know, it's been read in many different ways. Some people even say that some of the elements can be read as orishas, which are the deities of the Yoruba and Candomblé religions. And I think this is interesting because, you know, Madalena Santos Reinbolt was somebody who, in theory, identified as a Catholic but there are very few, obviously, she kept no journals. There are very few interviews with her. It's kind of hard to know exactly where she was coming from. But what she usually said about her works is that, you know, she had a head full of planets and that she just sort of imagined all these different kinds of worlds that she would then depict. And the worlds were both rooted in what she saw in her everyday life, but also rooted in what she saw in her head. And, you know, it's been said that these planets that she says can be understood as a kind of form of knowledge that bridges different worlds, or a meeting place for different knowledge systems. And I think this is particularly important, obviously, when discussing your work, Hellen, also when discussing your work, Sue, but also when thinking about textiles in Latin America in general. For example, decolonial thinker Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui kind of uses textiles as both metaphors and concrete examples of what she calls xeje, which is an epistemology of the South based on Aymara cosmology that speaks to the hybrid nature of Latin American identity, of history, of culture. And so it's basically a term that she translates from Aymara as kind of mottled or stained, and refers to a particular type of gray color that is made with black and white spots. And so for her, it's a symbolic meeting, like an interwoven constellation of contradictions. So, for example, in this case, Catholic iconography with Candomblé iconography, but in many different ways. And I think obviously in your case, Hellen, and I'll move on to this example that you talked about, this idea of translation and migration between knowledge systems, but also questioning the hierarchies of knowledge systems is so important. When you talked about this work, you mentioned this idea of the disintegration of certain kinds of knowledges. And so I wanted to kind of start from there, and also show this work by Sue, which you didn't mention in your presentation, Sue, but it's a lovely work that sort of continues sort of this process that you've undertaken, looking at sort of indigenous iconography and reinterpreting it through textile. And in this case, this work and you can talk about it a little bit if you would like, but I'll sort of give you free rein to talk about what you want. But I just wanted to use it as an example to show how it kind of brings together these two sort of systems of knowledge, and what happens when they violently sort of collide. And so obviously you're showing the manto. It shows a virgin of Satatusa, which is an indigenous sort of virgin that's been sort of transplanted into sort of like Catholic religious context. And so what happens when those two knowledge systems are forced together? Does something new come out of it? Can it be an entirely different world? And how can textiles sort of help us investigate this idea of hybridity that's so key to sort of thinking about Latin American relationships in general?
Yeah, those are all such wonderful and big questions to
I know, sorry.
No, like I'll try to kind of answer very authentically, because I'm not a Mayan woman, but I am Guatemalan, and Guatemala goes through me, right? Like I grew up in a place where the landscape, the visuals I had, the sounds, the smells, all of these things are coming both from colonialism and Mayan cultures. And I'm kind of meeting them in one way and from a very kind of privileged standpoint. And there have been moments where my use of the backstrap loom gets questioned, and why am I using it? And I have to be very honest in saying that it calls to me, and that it is there's a fine line between responsibility and appropriation. And if it's calling to me, it's also my responsibility to tend to it and learn to read the layers that I grew up in. Because and this goes back to my position as a translator, right? I can kind of position, one way of looking at my work can kind of be of that of like appropriating or taking, or you can give me a little bit of like expand a benefit of the doubt and say, okay, I'm looking to translate, to read deeper into the environment that I live, right? And trying to look at both sides and constantly be in that mode of translation is one that I quite resonate with when Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui talks about the position of the Cheje, right? Like you're looking at these sides. And so like on one side, I'm looking at the backstrap loom, and then on another side, I was schooled at the art school in the US, and I was looking at Donald Judd, right? And, there's all of these instances that I'm seeing, one and another and kind of bouncing back and forth. I think for this piece, so that I can speak a tad bit more specifically, is it started off because of my relationship to the backstrap loom and actually sitting down and learning how to read and write in the backstrap loom, I started realizing that a lot of the texts that address the backstrap loom were very like right on the borderline of violent. So there's this piece was inspired by looking at a text, an anthropological study where this woman came to Guatemala and was disintegrating all the textiles and, saying this one measures this and its symbols are this. And it's almost this very flat-footed way of looking at the textiles. Instead of reading them intertextually, it was being read autopsically, like it's like a pulling apart. This is the size, this is the symbol, this is the material, this is the technology, and so it's all getting pulled apart. And with some of the knowledge of art history that I had, I remembered this painting of how this was the form that this is how you should research, is by taking everything apart and analyzing it through this disintegrated lens. And I thought, after a long time working with the backstrap loom, that goes contrary to what I'm learning for in my own practice. So it's learning from this tool and then looking back at the way that I was taught and questioning it. So that then, brings it back to responsibility of when I'm working on the backstrap loom, of really listening and saying, this is no longer in accordance. And so now I have to push up and to question this act of disintegration. And there's ways of creating change and creating organization without violently doing so. I suspect. I'm not totally sure, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. And hopefully Sue's answer, or we can kind of talk about this.
Bueno, sí, igual coincido con Helen en que son preguntas.
I agree with Helen in that these are big questions.
Bueno, es que la hibridación.
But the truth is that
A ver, esta obra que muestra
this piece, Manto de la Casica, is another reference for me. As I mentioned, I established a relationship with each piece precisely because my desire is to respect the knowledge of those who came before us as seniors. The guane, or the artist behind this piece, are not people that are alive today. What is alive are some of their traditions. But in this case, there are more things that we could perhaps explore, but in other cases, it's not the case. So it's about finding very old objects, antique objects, and it's through these objects that I can connect to my heritage, my blood, which allows me to also face up to my own racism or the fact that I've never received a comment of someone that is judging me for speaking to these images because, as I said, there was a very violent whitening process occurred in this part of our country along the mountain range of Colombia. So my desire has been to be closer to the rural people and areas and to these indigenous traditions. This image is based on a painting that is curiously in Ciutat Tausa, and that was covered for many years. This painting was from the year 1670, but in the 90s, they were fixing the church, and behind the layers, they found this mural painting, which is a reference for this painting. When taking off the lime, they were able to uncover it. So it's a woman or a virgin, which is why she enters the church. But they call her the capacica. It's a woman wearing indigenous textiles that are very similar to these muisca textile fragments from the Andean region, and they are painted. So this coverage of that which is indigenous is something that I believe is still must be resolved as Latin Americans. I have worked with this image, and I saw that they were asking a question about my work with artisans, artisan women. When I approach the rural traditions, I strive to learn from them, and I do learn from them indeed. I'm looking to find a lot of what we've forgotten in them. It's hard to describe in words, but it's something that can be done through actions. So textile traditions have been preserved. Manual cotton weaving is a tradition that has been preserved. This was woven by hand, and it had natural bark dye. This image of this virgin is quite curious because it's a mestiza woman. In other words, she doesn't have white skin like the Catholic Virgin Mary. And her silhouette is similar to the mountains that are right next to this church in Ciutat Tausa. So it's an incredible image. And in her clothing, she has an Inca piece, which also speaks of the connections across the continent and the mountain range, a tupu. And this is something that we need to review very carefully and also with bravery to acknowledge the contradiction present, the racism present. To think that, for example, because of my skin color, since I'm lighter, I can't speak of certain things. Well, then how can we speak of them in that case? So we have a lot of work to be done on these hybrid matters, and textile provides support for and coverage for many things. So I believe it's the softest medium that allows us to discuss and explore these matters. So I guess that's my response.
Sí, gracias. Sorry, thank you, Sue. And I agree. I think when looking at textiles, is there a way to kind of wonder whether hybridity does it always need to be violent, or can it also be harmonious? And does the sort of like that meeting together of warp and weft of the textile give us an example of like a harmonious meeting together of different knowledge systems? So I think it's both a kind of lovely conceptual and physical example of how we can kind of go about thinking about that hybridity that is so important in both of your work. And then I guess, because we don't have a lot of time left, I mean, Hellen, obviously you talked a lot about text and language in your presentation, and I wanted to maybe just touch upon it one last time. And I won't go too deeply into Madalena's work because I want to give you space to talk, but basically just to say that I brought in these two examples because it's sort of well known that Madalena didn't write or read. And so really textile and painting was her language, her own visual language. But there are different approaches to the way in which she did this. For example, this is a painting in which it's a really complex painting of a story in which a white woman runs away with an indigenous man. And she does write the sort of title of the work or of some words to kind of illustrate the story behind it in this painting. But then when she started sort of approaching her work through the medium of textiles, that sort of use of words kind of goes away. She signs her name, of course. In some cases, she uses numbers. But again, I like the idea of sort of her very intentionally using textile as its own language, creating an alternative language through textile, which I think is so important in your work, Hellen. Obviously, you're talking about the sort of meeting of these two particular systems, the system of textiles, which has its rigidities, and of course, the system of language or of writing that has its rigidities as well. And you talk about, for example, in this case, how you kind of like are imposing one over the other one. But in some cases, you're also thinking about how they work together. And in some cases, I think you're talking about how one can exist without the other one. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be really, would be really interesting. And then Sue, you ended with this work, which I think is really lovely because it sort of shows a new avenue for you. As you were saying, you're still looking at the sort of system of symbols, but now you're painting them yourselves. It's your own kind of system that's inspired by these sort of genealogy of systems that you've been looking at. And so I guess the again, big question is, how do you both approach this sort of meeting together of systems, and how do they, I guess it's like, can they be, again, can these two kind of meet, or several systems meet each other harmoniously? Are they antagonistic? How do you sort of approach them in each particular work? So yeah, maybe just these two examples would be helpful to keep it a little bit less big.
Thank you. That's such a great question. And I question a lot my use of alphabetical forms in textiles. I think when I started it was just a way to solve a problem. You know, as an artist, you're working and you don't have clarity. You're just kind of like going through it. And so initially, perhaps it was just this attempt of saying, I write, I weave, let's put them together. And so kind of going into the technical aspects of it, when I started putting words on my textiles, I was doing it through brocade. And what that means is I set up the warp, and then by using supplementary weft, I was grabbing kind of smaller pieces of thread and weaving it in, but it was an external aspect, like it's a supplementary, so meaning it's not part of the structure. So if I were to pick out the brocade, the weaving would still remain intact. The exciting thing for me, kind of going down more of the, like, let's say, technical and material language of the backstrap loom and what it offered, what possibilities it offered, was coming across this technique and warp picking. So it means that there's no supplementary threads here. What I'm doing is this act of choosing to pick one thread up kind of above when the shaft lifts, I'm choosing to, you know, leave one thread up or leave it down, and therefore, like embedded within the structure, these words, these letters can appear. So it's luz azul. And so that, to me, that like shift from adding something external now has been a little bit more limited, because yes, what I'm adding here externally are the letters, but I'm no longer adding in external threads. Like it's embedded within the weaving. And one of the things that I think a lot about, and this is where I'm at right now, is understanding how the language gets encoded through this form of directions or directionality, and my position in relation to that. So I think a lot, you know, is the shaft up or down? Am I working from right to left or left to right? And I know this is kind of a very technical way to describe things, but often, in fact, when I'm teaching, students will say to me, oh, I'm lost within my own weaving, you know, and I think that that's such a beautiful thing, because thinking of how they describe weaving, or if they're asking me as they're learning to weave, where am I? And it's like, oh, okay, you're located up and you're located right, you know, so you're always in relationship to, or thinking about how Lupita said, in the threads I found. And then the question kind of pops open in a really beautiful way, because it is no longer how am I encoding, but where am I in relationship to? And so it brings back this notion of relationship as opposed to essence, I would say, which is a thing I want to which is a thing I like critique in my head, like what is the essence of a thing? I don't know what it is, but I can come to understand it through its relationship. And so then writing becomes this act of building a relationship with the textile. So yeah, even if the alphabetical forms are still there, you can see how, you know, by turning it into a palindrome, by changing the technique for picking, like I'm kind of popping open the question a little bit more.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Like, and in a way, when they come together, they sort of become something else also.
Sí, yo creo también que en lo textil, al haber una
Yes, I
experiencia tan
think
corporal
that
en
since we have such a
aprendizaje,
bodily experience in
ya en sí
textiles,
pues,
and
no sé, se habita un lenguaje distinto al
we
racional,
inhabit a different language to the
digamos, más
rational language,
académico, ¿no? Como
and the rational
expresarse de
language is
otras
more
formas
academic, and
de
we
sentir. Yo creo
allow the
que
ways of feeling. I believe that
hay un peligro en romantizar esta
there is a
hibridación.
danger
La
in
pregunta
romanticizing
es si
this
es excitante
hybridation,
o puede ser
and
aburrido o no,
in
no
terms
lo
of
sé.
whether this should be
Este
shocking or
sincretismo,
whether
esta
it should be kind.
hibridación
I think this
cultural,
syncretism
como
or
si
this
las tejidoras
hybridization of
perfectas
cultures,
gracias a su suavidad,
as I said, the textile allows
un poco
for
a
us
los
to do
tejidos,
that,
sí, como esta
given its
experiencia
softness
corpórea del
and
textil,
given its
de
bodily
no sé,
bodily
decir
experience of
atraviesa el
the
cuerpo,
textile.
¿no?
And
Entonces,
an
por
understanding
ejemplo,
as a, you know, knowledge going
otro
through the
tratamiento
body.
de
So
de esa
this
violencia
allows us to have
cultural
a different
como la
way of
hibridación.
treating this
Y
hybridization
en
of
ese sentido,
cultures
pues es como
and collision of cultures. But I think in that
yo
sense,
creo que sí hay una
I believe that
resistencia
there is
en que estos
resistance
textiles sigan existiendo, de que estas
in terms
técnicas
of
sigan
these
existiendo. Hay
textiles.
que buscar,
They continue
porque
existing,
como
because
que suavizarnos,
and we should just
¿no?
look
Como tienen mucho
into that
que,
because they have a way of
como que arropar en
making us
nosotros. Entonces,
softer, and they have a
uno se
lot
puede ser
to
amable,
wrap around us. So I think this can be
que
very
nos
a
permite
very
como que atraviese
kind
el cuerpo, entonces pueden
action.
aparecer
If we
nuevas
allow
formas
this to go
de
through the body, I
expresarse,
think new ways of expression start coming
esta,
up.
como esta integridad de mundos distintos, ¿no?
In terms
En
of,
esta obra de
thinking about these different
pues
worlds.
se llama número 11 porque son como unas
This
pequeñas
work is number 11 because it's
piezas,
it's a series of
pero
exercises that I worked on, but
hacía un tiempo había muerto un perro mío.
Yes, some time before that, a dog that my dog died, and we have the silhouette of that dog. And this is again it's an anecdote, but it's a way of storing and recording a memory for me, and it's very beautiful and it's harmonious, and because I allow that to go through my body, so I basically allow all that to appear there on the textile. This is something that I did at night. I don't know if it was a full moon. I can imagine it was a full moon when I made it, but I'm not too clear on that. But because there's a moon there, but I think that this hybridization allows me to use these things in the works in a very soft manner, even if I have a lot of frictions internally. It will be something like that.
Gracias, Sue. Sorry, so I think we're out of time. So Mathilde, I'll maybe hand it over to you to coordinate the Q&A, but I just wanted to say thank you both for taking the time to think through big questions and also being so generous with your answers. And thank you, Mathilde.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Hellen and Sue, for being so generous with your work and sharing your beautiful insight on the work of Madalena. We have a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to relay them before we close. We have a question that I thought was very interesting, thinking again across South America, which was kind of like the idea behind this program. So it's from Julian Sanchez Gonzalez. How can we think about the work of the artist weaving in relation to the politics of Madalena's work? Colombia's Terry Doras de Mampuran, I'm sorry for pronunciation, and host from the artist from the Salantiname Art School from Nicaragua. Can we trace a continuum across time and space in their approaches? If you want to answer to this question, and maybe Anna also, if you have any thoughts on that question. Hellen, I see you nodding. Do you want to? No.
I was catching up with reading it. So I'm
trying sorry.
on it a little.
I guess that's a hard question, and thank you, Julian. Very smart one. I will say, I guess, in terms of this idea of the everydayness and of the sort of meeting textiles as a meeting space is a sort of like an ongoing thread, I would say, and Sue and Hellen can talk about that even more than me, but I would say that to try to answer Julian's question, this idea of textile as obviously as something that has been done in the domestic space and of course generally by women is something that is an ongoing thread, not just in Latin America. I think it's an ongoing thread just overall. But I think these spaces have been historically in Latin America spaces also for organizing. And so the Tejedoras de Mampujan were women in Colombia, for those of you who don't know, women who were displaced because of the armed conflict in Colombia after a massacre by the autodefensas. And then they basically had to leave their territory, and then they began kind of organizing together to sort of quilt as a way to sort of process grief, but also process that sort of longing for home or trying to kind of rebuild or, re-sow a connection to the land. And I think that's just, this is an interest for me, and I think it's an ongoing thing where textiles in a way can kind of help us connect to the sense of loss because these are practices that have been passed down. And at the same time, because they are spaces where you gather within the home, they have provided safe spaces for women to organize both personally and also politically. And so I think if I'm answering this question correctly, which is a complex one, I would say that in this way, maybe we could sort of connect some of the work by Madalena or contemporary, artists from Latin America that are still working with thread in the domestic space. In a way, they're kind of connecting to these lineages of production. But, I did my best.
It was a hard question, but also
Yeah.
thinking about the politics of Madalena, like that's I think really interesting, connecting the practice of textile making and also a political act of inscribing you in time and space, which is something we also talked about during another conversation with the curators in Brazil and the US of the exhibition on view at the museum. And something I think you, and I don't know if you and Ellen, you would like to add to those questions. I'm sure you have a lot also to share.
I think the only thing that I would add is, or because you're saying here, sorry, I to address the part of the question, like how do we think about the artist? How do I think about my work in relation to the politics of Madalena's work? I'll kind of say of how I think of it, how I think of textiles politically in that sense is without, when you allow a form to emerge, when you aren't pushing an agenda, when you aren't, anyway, it will emerge if you're, it kind of sensibilizes you to listen to the thing that's coming out. And so, for example, in the case with Anna, when I was taking in this raffia, I'm not pushing my textiles on any of the people that I'm working with. I realize that I have to sit and be in space with them for long periods of time. And if I occupy myself in some forms as a way to pass time, because I can't necessarily be speaking, nor should I be like influencing during all of these long periods of time, then eventually some of the things that I'm doing, whether it's drawing or small weavings, or, I also do these braids, or I bring in markers, something about the nature of that will call so that they too can put their voices in. And I'm seeing myself in that moment as a willing viewer or listener to their stories. And I think that that's when it becomes a political act, is by having somebody not just write, but then read and respond to what it is you're putting there. And so Anna is one case, but I can also mention ED, or I can mention some other people where this has been the case, that I'm kind of on the receiving end of what they're putting out there. And to kind of be sensitive to acknowledge that these are forms of that go beyond like aesthetics, or like there's something else coming out as well. So I guess that's what I would add to it. I don't know if that was necessarily addressing your question, but I tried.
Do you want to add something?
Bueno, de pronto, sí, ¿no?
Yes,
De pronto como,
maybe
pues comentar que
I just wanted to comment
en el momento en que yo decido irme a vivir al
about the
campo,
fact that when I decided to go and to live in
también
the
he
countryside,
visto
in a rural area, I then also
muchas
decided
experiencias rurales y muy
to
ajenas
have a lot of rural
a lo
experiences
artístico,
that were very distant from
donde encontré
my
este
artistic
entretejido
work, where
casualmente,
I
¿no? Y
found
pues
weaving
no lo busqué,
as
¿no?
uh,
Entonces es algo que
I
está
wasn't looking for it. I
acompañando
just found it.
a
So
las
this is
personas de,
something that is there
de muchos lugares y particularmente acá en
for people
Santander,
from many
que
different places, and
al
particularly
compartir
here
estas
in the region of
cotidianas
Santander.
con las
So when I
artesanas
started sharing
de
this
esta región,
daily
que no solo
lives
comparto,
with the artisans of this region
encuentro
that have had the
una
opportunity of
especie como
sharing,
de
I found
posición
an
muy
expression
femenina, muy directa,
of a very
realmente
feminine
desde el
point, a
sostener
political
las
point of
cosas y
view.
desde este trabajo,
This experience of being at home and
sí,
sustaining
artesanal
everything,
tan
and
cotidiano y
um,
tan
and
sofisticado.
making a living
Además
through
somos
this very
artesanas
artisanal and
de
very
una forma que
sophisticated
eleva
work,
puntos.
which
Entonces,
shows us that we can elevate things
creo que
together.
ahí
So I think there is a political response there when in action more than in the discourse. And as Hellen said, it doesn't try to fill in an agenda, but it just responds to things that emerge and are there.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we have to close here. I know we have so many questions and there are so many themes in the question that have been raised that have been running through all your presentations, the question of archives, storytelling, writing systems. So I'm sorry we can't answer everything, but I hope we will continue having this conversation on other platforms. It was a pleasure to work with you three. And Anna, I'd like again to thank you for collaborating on this program and introducing us to the wonderful work of Sue and Hellen. It was really, really wonderful to have you here and have you also dialogue in relation to Madalena Santos Reinbolt.